the South African Reserve Bank's Quarterly Bulletin for the first quarter of 2026. Now, I know, central bank reports can sound a bit dry, right? But honestly, this one is an absolute gold mine. It is quite literally our roadmap to understanding the current state of the economy. We're going to take all this complex data and build a really clear, fascinating picture of exactly what is happening in the world around us. I want to start off by asking you a question. How does a geopolitical conflict on the other side of the planet, or a shift in global weather patterns like La Nina, actually end up affecting how much money you have in your wallet at the end of the month? It's so easy to think of macroeconomics as something that only happens in boardrooms, but today we're going to connect those massive, high-level global events directly to your everyday reality. To help us visualize this, I want you to think of the South African economy right now as a heavily loaded cargo ship navigating some incredibly turbulent global waters. The overarching theme of this Q1 2026 report is resilience amidst friction. The waters are super choppy, the winds are howling, and there are massive global and local headwinds pushing back against the ship. Yet, somehow the engines are still churning and it is persistently pushing forward. Let's look at exactly how fast it's moving. Section 1. The big picture. Gross domestic product. Okay, let's dive into this. We always have to start with the big picture to establish our baseline. And there is the magic number for the first quarter of 2026, 0.5%. The South African economy grew by 0.5%. Now, out of context, 0.5% might sound a little underwhelming. You might be thinking, is that really something to celebrate? But when you consider those turbulent waters we just talked about, the global frictions, the local hurdles, this number represents a massive, hard-fought victory for the economy.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean by resilience. Tracking real gross domestic product reveals that this 0.5% bump isn't a fluke. This actually marks the 6th consecutive quarter of economic expansion. For a year and a half, despite every single odds stacked against it, the economy has completely refused to contract. That cargo ship just keeps moving forward. But to understand how it's moving, we really need to lift the hood and look at the engine room.
Section 2. Sector breakdown. Winners and losers. Let's see how this builds into the sector-by-sector breakdown. An economy is never just one single thing moving in perfect unison, right? It's made up of different engines. And in Q1, some of those engines were pulling a lot of weight, while others were absolutely dragging. We have a real tale of two sectors here. The primary sector, which includes agriculture and mining, was the big winner, rebounding with a 1.9% expansion. On the flip side, the secondary sector, which is mostly manufacturing, contracted by 0.5%. And actually, that's the third consecutive quarterly decline for the secondary sector, getting hammered by subdued global demand, rising input costs, and those frustrating supply chain disruptions. Let's focus on the good news first, that primary sector rebound. What drove it? Well, oddly enough, nature and global anxiety. We saw fantastic weather conditions tied to La Nina-induced rainfall, which caused a huge boost in agricultural output, specifically for field crops and horticulture. At the exact same time, because the global geopolitical landscape was just so uncertain, nervous investors around the world flocked to safe haven assets. That drove up demand and prices for gold and platinum group metals, giving the South African mining sector a desperately needed boost. But remember our theme, resilience amidst friction. It wasn't completely smooth sailing for the primary sector. Agriculture was heavily constrained by terrible outbreaks of animal diseases over the past year, specifically foot and mouth disease and African swine fever, which limited livestock production and even blocked access to certain export markets. Meanwhile, mining had to contend with lower iron ore and coal production, hampered by scheduled Transnet maintenance and logistical bottlenecks. So all that growth we saw, it happened entirely in spite of these very tangible hurdles. Section 3. The household squeeze. Impact on citizens. So the crucial point is, what does all this macroeconomic data actually mean for you and me? We are transitioning now into what I like to call the emotional core of this explainer. Looking at the everyday household, the data tells a really tough story. The ratio of household debt to nominal disposable income, which is basically take-home pay, has risen to 62.2%. What this data shows is that household debt is increasing way faster than disposable income. The average citizen is feeling a severe squeeze, relying on credit just to bridge the gap. As a direct result, growth in real final consumption expenditure, basically how much people are spending, practically flatlined at just 0.1% for the quarter. People simply don't have the extra cash. And that financial squeeze is heavily compounded by this stark number, 345,000. That is how many jobs were lost across the formal, informal, and household sectors in just the first quarter of 2026. This pushed the official unemployment rate up significantly to 32.7%. When you see a number like that, it really grounds the abstract economic data in human reality. But it's my job to help you understand why this sudden spike happened right now. The data points us to a very specific cause. A massive chunk of these job losses occurred in the community and social services sector, and this coincided directly with the wrap-up of Phase 5 of the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative back in November 2025. So while it is obviously a painful drop in employment, understanding that it was tied to the end of a specific government initiative helps us contextualize this sudden shift in the data. You could actually see the ripple effect of this household squeeze when we look at the tertiary sector, which covers services and trade. Now, overall, the tertiary sector grew by 0.6%, which is great. Finance, real estate, and transport all had a good quarter. But if you dig into the commerce subsector, everyday retail trade activity actually weakened. General dealers and food retailers saw drops in sales. Why? Because of that 62.2% debt ratio and rising unemployment. The consumer is simply tapped out. Section 4. Global Ripples, Impact on Trade. Let's zoom back out from the household level to the macro level. We've seen the local pressure, but we need to understand the external forces acting as the wind and waves crashing against our cargo ship. I want you to think about this. Why did prices suddenly jump? After remaining pretty tame throughout 2025, inflation suddenly accelerated from March 2026. What triggered that sudden sting at the fuel pump and the grocery store? The Reserve Bank report lays out a perfect domino effect. It started with the escalation of the war in the Middle East. That geopolitical conflict sent shockwaves through global energy markets, causing international Brent crude oil prices to surge from around $64 a barrel in January all the way up to $103.90 by May. Because South Africa imports oil, that global spike was instantly felt locally. Domestic petrol inflation hit a staggering 24.8%, and diesel hit 53.8%. And of course, that fuel hike bled straight into the cost of transporting goods, pushing overall inflation right back up. You can clearly see how our cargo ship and global supply chains at large were rocked by this. The heightened global uncertainty, the sudden spike in crude oil, the sticky inflation, it completely changed the global financial mood. Major central banks around the world suddenly hit the brakes on their plans to cut interest rates, reverting back to a restrictive stance. This triggered a ton of volatility for emerging market currencies, and the rand definitely took a hit in March as global investors scrambled towards safe haven assets. But hey, let's pivot to the good news, because there is a fantastic silver lining in this report. Despite the massive bill for oil imports, South Africa's overall trade surplus actually widened significantly in Q1. This means the economy is exporting way more value than it's bringing in. This was heavily driven by the mining sector. We were exporting much larger volumes of iron ore, and because global prices for our gold and PGMs were so high, it completely offset the cost of that imported fuel. And we absolutely cannot forget our agricultural heroes. 17.1 million tons. That is the estimated commercial maize crop for the season. If realized, this is going to be the largest commercial maize harvest on record for South Africa. It's an absolute masterclass in domestic resilience and a huge boon for our agricultural exports, especially vegetable products, which saw a massive jump in export volumes this quarter. So, bringing the narrative full circle back to our cargo ship, what we have here is essentially a macro sandwich. Globally, we have a storm of geopolitical tension and expensive oil. Down at the micro level, we have squeezed households dealing with heavy debt and job losses. But zooming back out to the macro level, we have a ship that grew its GP by 0.5%, expanded for a sixth consecutive quarter, widened its trade surplus, and is looking at a record-breaking maize harvest. It is literally the definition of a resilient economy weathering a serious storm. Which leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question as we wrap up this explainer. With the macro data showing a robust, growing trade surplus, but the micro data showing exhausted, squeezed households, which way will the economic scales tip next quarter? Can the macro engines pull the average consumer out of the rough water, or will household exhaustion start to drag the whole ship down? It's a fascinating, ongoing story, and I cannot wait to dive into the next report with you to find out. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.